Hello out there, all you beautiful internet people. It's time to talk about the highly anticipated 2023 movie Oppenheimer, starring Cillian Murphy as J. Robert Oppenheimer and directed by Christopher Nolan. Is this movie the bomb, or does it bomb? We'll find that out today in today's review. So let's get into the review. Oppenheimer time.
Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent.
So, I have a long and complicated history with Christopher Nolan. On the one hand, I don't like most of his movies. I don't like Interstellar, I don't like The Dark Knight, or The Dark Knight Rises, or Batman Begins, or Inception, or Tenet, really. I kinda remember liking Insomnia when I saw that on VHS. Like, it was okay. And then I remember watching Memento on VHS. And I'd say out of all the Christopher Nolan movies, Memento was probably my favorite. Just because being so early on in his career, it's before he got really pretentious and full of himself. And it's a lot more experimental than his other movies. And the reverse chronology can seem kind of like a gimmick upon first watch, but it's a pretty cool narrative device that no other movie uses, so I kind of do like Memento. It's kind of a fun watch, but aside from that, I don't really like Christopher Nolan's style. On the other hand, though, there is something extremely unique and recognizable about Christopher Nolan's style, and I do respect him for that, because unlike Quentin Tarantino, the greasy little cheddar goblin of Hollywood, who just shamelessly rips off much better films and repackages them and pretends like he invented that aesthetic, Christopher Nolan does have a recognizable, relatively distinct aesthetic that you can latch onto. Some people might say, well, Nicholas, you're not having enough of an open mind. But think about it this way, right? It takes more of an open mind to dislike something that's popular, like The Dark Knight, than it does to like something that's popular. And no matter what Christopher Nolan ever does, I will never like The Dark Knight. I think it's a terrible movie, it's a terrible interpretation of Batman, and I maintain that Heath Ledger is the second worst Joker after Jared Leto. Just a terrible interpretation of the character. I don't know who the fuck still watches The Dark Knight and watches Heath Ledger's goofy-ass voice, his goofy-ass rasp voice, and goes, yeah, that's a great interpretation of the character there. I do think that the hype around The Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises has kind of died down as people realize, like, just how lackluster and piss-poor Tom Brady's Bane is. I do think the hype around The Dark Knight has, for the most part, like, died down, and people have kind of acknowledged that it's not the best interpretation of Batman after we've gotten both the Batman and Joker, which, like, that's a great character study of the Joker from people who clearly understand the Joker as a character. But, like, Christopher Nolan obviously does not understand the Joker or Batman as characters, and he has no place whatsoever directing a fucking Batman movie, because Batman movies are supposed to be fun, and the last thing I need is this pretentious, heavy-handed auteur coming in and pretending like his Batman movie is like this grand opera, or like this symbolic genius masterwork. It's Batman, you know? I want a fun Batman movie. I don't want a boring, drawn-out, 3-hour snooze-fest Batman movie. Nobody needs that. Yeah, my favorite Christopher Nolan movie is probably Memento. My least favorite is definitely The Dark Knight, and then all the rest of them kind of fall somewhere in the middle where they're just, like, really boring. And I can't say there's ever been a Christopher Nolan movie that's really, like, gripped me by the shirt, shaking me all every which way and made me just go, holy shit. Because that's not really how Christopher Nolan approaches filmmaking. See, with my autism, it's not possible for Christopher Nolan to just play some sad music or some happy music or some scary music in the background and for me to be manipulated into feeling those emotions. I tend to feel emotion while I'm watching a movie in a much more visceral, abstract way. So a movie like Eraserhead will elicit more emotions in me that a Christopher Nolan movie where he's just like, now it's time to feel this emotion, it's time to feel happiness, it's time to feel sadness. And he does all this in the most straightforward way possible with this extremely direct filmmaking. You can just tell he knows the entire language of cinema, and he's able to just cut these scenes together such that they elicit a specific emotion from the audience at a specific time. And it's pretty cheap and pretty tacky and pretty lazy, but to me it just doesn't work. Like if Christopher Nolan's like, it's time to feel sad now, I'm just like, well why though? Why am I supposed to feel sad? Because you're shooting this scene in like a monotone color? Why am I supposed to feel sad about this? Oh, because you're pointing the lens in a certain way towards these characters. It's like a very methodical, planned out, strategic sort of way. I approach filmmaking from the opposite direction. I think the magic of filmmaking is the spontaneity and the unconscious, and the fact that you can provoke deeper truths about the human condition via pointing cameras at stuff with a degree of spontaneity, and I think all the best directors employ that technique to a certain extent. Even Stanley Kubrick, who's obviously very meticulous about all the details that go into his films, never tells you what to feel at any given moment. He's not condescending to you. He doesn't add in specific cues or stings in the soundtrack to make you feel a certain way. You can feel a multitude of different ways about every Kubrick movie, and that's kind of the point, is that you're free to interpret them however you want. In opposition to Christopher Nolan, who's just kind of like, yep, this is the sad scene, this is the happy scene, this is the exciting scene now, time to be excited. So, for the first half hour or so of watching Oppenheimer, I would say, it does take a little bit to ease yourself into the Nolan world, where like every scene is just punctuated by this loud, dramatic opera music, and it's really annoying at first, especially during the scenes where like nothing is happening. It's just going over like Oppenheimer's early years, just talking to people, and yet this giant sweeping score is in the back, like, and you're like, what's there to be excited about? They're not launching the bomb yet. They're just like fucking talking. And there's no room to breathe in scenes with that much backing music, and it really works best in the later half of the movie where epic shit is actually happening, and there's like revelations about the personalities of J. Robert Oppenheimer and Louis Strauss as they conflict with each other in these epic Senate hearings. You know, that's the epic part. Early on, when they're just like in the train and there's these like violins going on in the back, you're just kind of like, you know, why put so much music in this movie? But that's just how Christopher Nolan does. He wants to overwhelm the audience with as much emotion as possible. And to do that, he just layers every fucking scene with just music and music and music and music. And it gets kind of boring. And then the other thing that Christopher Nolan does, obviously, is the script is extremely exposition heavy. This isn't like No Country for Old Men, where you have these really long, drawn-out, beautiful scenes of just people not really saying that much because they don't need to say that much, because film is a visual medium and you can just communicate with visuals. Christopher Nolan's like, well, so-and-so is going over here, and then this happened this year, and then that happened that year. And I think this works for Oppenheimer, actually, because it is about history and about the ways that these various figures interact throughout the years. So it is kind of nice to have all the puzzle pieces fit in and people describe what they're doing and what's going on, because, you know, most people aren't aware of this stuff. Most people aren't like deep into history shit these days, even though they absolutely should be. So I do think it works for that. Some of the exposition comes off a little unnatural, like they say stuff that you wouldn't really say like at that exact point in time, and I doubt was ever really said, but hey, it's a movie, so I'll let that slide. You know, the script has to be written somehow, and if it's a little clunky, if it's a little unnatural here and there, and they mention some stuff that wouldn't really like be delivered in the most natural way, it wouldn't really make the most sense, you know, whatever. It's a script. That's fine. But those are the two things you really have to get over when you first start watching Oppenheimer. It's just that there's a shit ton of exposition all the way through, and there's a lot of fucking operatic music just playing in the background, just heavy hitting, just every fucking scene. Oppenheimer will be just talking to someone in a room, and it'll be like, wah, wah, wah. And, you know, that's Nolan, that's Christopher Nolan right there, that's his game, you know. That's one of the reasons I like Memento so much, actually, is that it's just got that one little musical cue, that quiet little ching, 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 which is really cool. I think that's a nice little musical bit. And at the end when he burns the photos, I think there's kind of a more sweeping score at the end there. But I really like that Memento theme that's just like the hotel room song. It's actually really a cool score. Maybe one of the coolest movie scores of all time, actually. It's crazy underrated, the motel room song. Anyway, I'm kind of getting off track here. I tried my best not to spoil Oppenheimer for myself before I went in to watch it. Usually I don't care too much about spoilers, but like I said, I wanted to go into this with an open mind because I really don't like Christopher Nolan that much as a director. I don't think he's that great. He's not really all he's cracked up to be, but it could be that, you know, maybe he's finally hit his stride with this one. Maybe he's finally happened upon something that's actually worth making a fucking movie about, and maybe he's gonna make a competent movie this time around instead of having Heath Ledger be the Joker. So I tried to go into this with as open a mind as possible. Well, I didn't want, like, I'm gonna hate this, I wasn't like, I'm gonna love it. I'm like, I'll see what I think about it afterwards. I did make the mistake, though, of watching a shitty video by Big Joel, one of the worst film analysts here on YouTube, who just makes crappy troll meme videos about everything and has zero humor whatsoever. Like, this guy is one of the least funny people on the entire website of YouTube. It's embarrassing to think that we've gone from like Chevy Chase to fucking Big Joel in terms of who we look up to as like figures of humor in the popular mind sphere. Holy shit, this Big Joel video about the Oppenheimer movie was crap. He basically just shits on Oppenheimer because there's the scene where Oppenheimer's having sex and then his girlfriend is like, I become death, and she pulls the bag of Ed Gita off the shelf. And it's like, how come Robert Oppenheimer knows about that quote before he says it? And it's like, well, obviously Oppenheimer would have had to know about that quote before he said it at Los Alamos. It's not like he had a copy of the bag of Ed Gita on him. He'd have to have heard about it somewhere. Like, sure, it probably wasn't while he was having sex, but that's okay because it's a movie and some events are created. And also, like, a central theme of the film is Oppenheimer's impotence, if you didn't notice that, Big Joel. And also, it's called foreshadowing. It's a pretty common fucking narrative device, and I don't blame Christopher Nolan for utilizing foreshadowing. It's okay that it's while he's having sex. Like, I swear, I think Big Joel is just too fucking immature to accept that there's a scene in a movie where people are having sex, and Oppenheimer's having sex. How dare Oppenheimer have sex? He's too ugly to have sex. It's so stupid. It's such childish, watered-down, garbage film criticism, and it's embarrassing to think people might actually watch that and consider that like an accurate or fair evaluation of the Oppenheimer movie. Why is Oppenheimer having sex? Bazinga. And there's just no meat on the bone to this type of film criticism. It's sad to think that we live in an era where figures like Big Joel are taken seriously about any sort of movie. Just stick to reviewing Disney movies, Big Joel, for fuck's sake. And then in the comments of the Big Joel video, it's like, there's that one scene where it talks about John F. Kennedy before John F. Kennedy was the president in 1959. It's the MCU-ification of history. And it's like, no, do you think John F. Kennedy didn't exist before he became the president? Do you think politicians don't exist before they become elected? Like, what the fuck? Maybe John F. Kennedy did vote on the Oppenheimer hearings. That sounds likely. He existed. It's not like they're gonna make a Kennedy movie now. It's not the MCU-ification of history. This is a good, competent movie. It's as far from the fucking MCU as I think it's possible to get. It's not part of a franchise or anything, as far as we know. It's that history is a continuous process where people and things interact. So, like, yeah, no shit. JFK could have had something to do with Oppenheimer when he was younger, because he was younger. The same way Eisenhower was a general in World War II before he was president in the 50s. You don't know this shit? Just the most, like, puerile, stupid, garbage criticism I've ever fucking heard. How dare they mention JFK in the 50s? He only existed in the 60s. What the fuck? So I was determined not to let that garbage Big Joel video deter me from possibly enjoying Oppenheimer if it was actually good. So I blocked that out of my mind and I went to go see Oppenheimer. One of the really great things about Oppenheimer is that it tells all the asshats who are like, there aren't any such things as original ideas anymore. It tells them to go shove it. Because let's be fair, there hasn't been a good movie made about J. Robert Oppenheimer and the development of the atomic bomb. Bingo, original idea that Christopher Nolan happened to stumble across and thought, I can make a movie out of this. Really basic shit. It's a really interesting story that should have more movies made about it. In many ways, I kind of see the development of the atomic bomb as a dark mirror image of the moon landing, those being the two most important moments of the 21st century. So, while we have a lot of movies about the moon landing, we don't have nearly enough about the atomic bomb. The only other example being from 1989 with Fat Man and Little Boy, the Paul Newman, John Cusack movie, which all things considered doesn't look nearly as good as Oppenheimer. So here we have a really original, cool idea that hasn't been done before, at least not in a competent way, with like a great director and a great script and great acting. So we have free real estate here. We have Oppenheimer, we have the ability to create this icon, and we have the ability to tell this really interesting story in a really interesting way, and to do it all with a ton of studio money. So I think Oppenheimer, right off the bat, when I went to go see it, has a lot of potential behind it. It has a lot of potential to make people want to go see a fucking movie again, and clearly it did, but that's mainly just because there hasn't been a movie like this for the longest time, where it's just like an original, fresh idea that hasn't been done before, and is interesting to watch, and is fun to watch, and isn't just like, well, it's Captain Marvel and the Revengers and the Guardians of the Universe Part 605. And people are getting fucking sick of that. So this is the opportune time for Oppenheimer to start popping. And I'd say that Christopher Nolan was pretty damn sharp to get this out right now. I'm not going to talk about Barbenheimer in this video. I don't give a shit about any of that. So anyway, I would argue that the most interesting theme in Oppenheimer is the central conflict between fascism, communism, and the American centrality that Oppenheimer finds himself caught in, and the fact that the Soviets technically aren't our enemies. They are technically our allies during World War II, but at the same time, we have to keep all this information secret from them, so we feel like we're being deceptive to our own allies who are helping us fight the Nazis, which, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the most fucking interesting things about World War II, the fact that we were cooperating with the Soviets, which I think is fucking awesome. But Oppenheimer does present the subject with a lot of nuance in presenting the corrupt Communist Party that Oppenheimer happens to attend a couple times, which its depiction of the communists is pretty damn interesting. All the makeup and costumes and sets in this thing, god damn, they all look absolutely wonderful. They all look so period accurate. Cillian Murphy's makeup is awesome. Robert Downey Jr. is caked in so much fucking makeup you can barely even recognize him as the villainous bastard Louis Strauss. It's so cool, and it's so good to see Robert Downey Jr. in a role that actually respects his acting capabilities. Brings me back to the days of A Scanner Darkly. back when Robert Downey Jr.'s acting potential was actually taken seriously, back before he was chewed up and spit out by the fucking Marvel money machine and everyone just knew him as fucking Iron Man. It's about time Robert Downey Jr. gets some real roles again, because you completely buy him in this. Lewis Strauss is a captivating antagonist to watch, and of course he's a twist villain. But if you're watching this video, you know that I don't give a shit about spoilers. I expect you to watch the movie first. If you don't watch the movie first, you don't know that Lewis Strauss is a villain. I mean, he's considered as much by history, so if you don't know that he is, like, there you go. It's already known, you know. You've had 70 years to learn this shit, and it's not my fault that I'm revealing it to you now. You should just watch the movie first if you haven't. Sorry. I mean, that's it. That's one thing I wish this movie kind of delved into more, is how Lewis Strauss is viewed by history as a villain and how he's seen as this horrible bastard, because obviously history, especially with figures like Lewis Strauss, who just kind of seems like some guy as far as I can tell, it's not like the worst guy, and I'm sure he'd actually be more of like a gray area character in a more nuanced movie that's not a big Christopher Nolan drama that's telling you what to think at every possible opportunity. But I do think that he's a really hateable bastard in this, and you'll never see it coming, but goddamn, you buy Robert Downey Jr. as just this scheming manipulator pulling the strings behind the scenes. I will admit that it does seem a little pulled out of last minute, like after the atomic bomb. It feels like they kind of have to pull this conflict out of nowhere, because there hasn't really been a conflict up until that point. It's shown scenes from the Senate hearing, but it hasn't really gone in depth as to like what's going on in them exactly, aside from the Oppenheimer's being suspected of communism. So I do feel like the fact that Strauss is a twist villain is kind of forced. The conflict at the end is kind of forced, like they just have to force some kind of conflict in there. But of course it is a real event, and it's a really interesting event that like Lewis Strauss was able to get Oppenheimer's security clearance revoked, which is not like Oppenheimer could have done all that much with a security clearance, because he just died of cancer and radiation poisoning, you know, because of course he did. Actually, I think, he died of lung cancer because he smoked so fucking much, because everyone back in those days just smoked 50 packs a day, and of course, there's a little radiation probably too. I mean, it's really unavoidable when you're in a fucking Trinity, you know, you're gonna breathe in some fucking isotopes, you know. So Oppenheimer isn't exactly the picture of health, and I like how this movie perfectly captures Oppenheimer. God damn, Cillian Murphy looks like Oppenheimer. They got down pat. The button, the hat, the jacket, the pipe. I'd say my favorite point in the movie is when Oppenheimer suits up, he puts on his fucking jacket, he puts on his hat, he's like, I'm a dress like this. And that's some icon shit right there. So cool, striding down the main strip of Los Alamos like, I'm the guy in charge. I'm creating the atomic bomb now, bitch. You can't stop this. Oh yeah, super hot fire. Oppenheimer time. It's poppin' with Oppenheimer up in this pizzazz. That's my favorite bit, where he suits up, and it's just like a fun little play on, you know, or, you know, Iron Man suits up, or Batman suits up, or whatever. Boring. Let's see Oppenheimer suit up. Let's see this real guy from real history suit up. And it's so cool. I like how Oppenheimer looks like a fucking skeleton throughout all this. I think that's how he should be portrayed, like the fucking specter of death that he is. The creator of torture and terror and just awful things. It's a lovely little contrast that the film works in. I mean, that's how he really looked, you know. He looked like a fucking skeleton. And I think that's such a cool look. And he just sports it with so much confidence and such vigor. You know, Cillian Murphy's one of those actors who just completely encapsulates the guy that he's playing. It's a very respectful, exciting portrayal. Now it's time to talk about my own views on the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because while it may not relate directly to the Oppenheimer movie, I think it's important to lay bare my thoughts on how bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the wrong choice for us to make. I've had a lot of interesting discussions about this with people, about a potential alternate history where we invaded Japan via the ground and just killed people with conventional weapons like guns rather than a giant megaton exploding ball of death from above that killed a shit ton of civilians, like, over 200,000 civilians, and ultimately just kept, like, the ruling class of Japan in power. And the Emperor of Japan today is the grandson of Hirohito, who is a literal fascist. So I think what we should have done, and this is what we would have done if FDR hadn't died and President Truman hadn't taken over, I think things would have gone a lot differently in the last months or so of World War II if FDR hadn't died, because I have faith that FDR would not have authorized the atomic bomb being dropped on Japan. I think FDR was too cool a guy for that. One of the most respectable presidents in U.S. history. I think what probably would have gone on is we would have invaded Japan, and Tokyo would have been reduced to rubble like Berlin, but it would have been reduced to rubble less than Hiroshima was, because you just can't cause that much damage with conventional weapons as you can with an atomic fucking bomb. Like, an A-bomb is going to completely devastate an entire fucking city. So what we should have done is we should have gone into Japan, and instead of being little cowards and dropping our big ball of death on a bunch of innocent civilians, many of whom were women and children, we should have actually fought fascists. Like, we should have actually taken it to the Japanese Empire, and we should have said, fuck you, Hirohito, slipped some cyanide into his drink, and then instituted a democracy over there, just like we did with Germany. For whatever reason, in a modern context, we tend to give Japan kind of a free pass and be like, well, they would have fought to the last man. They would have fought so hard because they were all a bunch of fascist fanatics. And it's like, well, then fuck them. They were fascist fanatics. But at the very least, if we were going in with ground troops, rather than dropping a fucking atomic bomb, we would have been killing fascist fanatics as opposed to innocent women and children and just casual civilians who had nothing to do with the corrupt regime that Hirohito was running. I don't understand why we give a free pass to Japanese fascist fanaticism, but we don't give a free pass to German fascist fanaticism, because they're the exact same phenomenon. The only reason that Japan was able to be converted into a fascist dictatorship during World War II was because they had all these weird beliefs about how their emperor was God and shit, which are directly opposed to democracy, and which modern Japan still holds, by the way. They still consider their emperor a god being, and that's why constitutional monarchies don't fucking work, and why democracy is better, and why countries like South Korea and China are better countries than Japan. At the end of the day, if we had just gone into Japan and fucking overthrown the fascist dictatorship that was there, instead of being nice and all chummy with them and being like, how about you guys surrender, and then just allowing Hirohito, this pruny fascist, to live to a ripe old age, I think that's kind of fucked, the way that we give fascism such a free pass. I think that's kind of fucked up, if you ask me. And we also tend to forget that, like, if we had invaded Japan, it's not like we'd be fighting there alone. China and Korea would absolutely help us out, because China and Korea both fucking hated Japan, because Japan committed wartime atrocities in both those countries. So China and Korea, which for whatever reason we both tend to forget existed during World War II, would absolutely have our backs and help us take down Japan, which wouldn't be that hard considering that it was a technologically inferior country to America. We had the atomic bomb. We could just use it as a threat, kind of dangle it over their heads, say, give the fuck up and institute a democracy and stop having emperors and all this weird fascist shit, or we're going to use the atomic bomb. But ultimately, not directly killing like the Japanese army and just killing civilians is a coward's move, and it's really fucking lame. And I think history would have turned out a lot better if we hadn't dropped the atomic bomb. If we had done a ground invasion of Japan, it would have been actually easier and killed less innocent people. Japan today would be an efficient modern country instead of a xenophobic monarchist ethno-state. My thoughts on Japan are pretty well documented about how I don't like Japan. I don't like the administrative structure of Japan. I think countries that are still monarchies in the 21st century really suck ass. And I'd never in a million years consider like Japan a modern developed country, because they literally still have a guy who sits in a throne and is like given special privileges over the general populace, which I think is fucking stupid. But I'm not for the wanton murder of 200,000 civilians. I think that's fucking ridiculous. And the fact that some people actually still approve of the atomic bomb today and go like, yeah, that was fucking great. We should have killed those 200,000 civilians and kept a monarchy in Japan who could abuse their power, and the grandson today is literally the grandson of a fascist. Yeah, that's great. That's so fucking awesome to drop the atomic bomb. But, you know, let's not like actually create any real change over there. Let's not like create a countrywide reform on the scale of what we did to Germany, the trials at Nuremberg. Let's not prosecute any of the Japanese war criminals. No, let's put their names on shrines over there, because they were so noble and awesome. Let's not give any honor to the Chinese army who fought against fascism. No, let's glamorize the kamikaze. Great idea. So I think the way that we view Japan in a modern context is pretty interesting, especially like World War II era Japan, because we give them so many excuses, and yet we're still all for just like killing 200,000 innocent civilians as opposed to, you know, killing Hirohito, the fascist, which I think is just the stupidest possible perspective you could take. Does Oppenheimer delve into any of this? Not really. Most that the movie goes into is how Robert Oppenheimer feels about all the people he's killed with his fantastic invention, and how it's just a tool of death, and it's going to be used as weaponry against everyone from here on out, and the atomic age has started, and he's kind of fucked. And it kind of goes into his psyche during this whole ordeal. But it doesn't go all that much into the various like differences between the effects of a ground invasion versus the atomic bomb, which I think is one of the most interesting alternate history scenarios that ever could be considered. But ultimately, that's not the focus of Oppenheimer, is what would have happened if, you know, FDR had lived out and was willing to use conventional warfare because he wasn't a coward. I will say that if you are a Truman fan, you'll fucking hate this movie, because Gary Oldman's interpretation of Truman, it shits on Truman so hard, and I like that, because I don't like Truman. But any Truman fans, you're going to have a hard time watching this, because this movie just fucking hates Truman. It has no respect for Truman. It's maybe a little too hard on Truman, if I'm going to be honest. I mean, there's no way, you know, he was like exclusively behind the decision to bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Like, surely that was, you know, partially the responsibility of the army or whatever, but like, goddamn, Gary Oldman's just like, you don't like Truman after this movie. It just shits on Truman. There is a bit where one of the army guys is like, oh, Kyoto is a wonderful city. I take my wife there on our honeymoon, and it's like, the fuck, you do? To Japan? Like, who the fuck in early 20th century America was going over to Japan just like all casual, like, la-di-da, we're taking our vacation over here. Like, maybe to Hawaii, but like, to fucking Japan? How did that even let you over there? Like, they had closed borders for most of that period. They didn't let fucking foreigners in. They especially didn't like Americans. What the fuck, is this army guy like an early weeb or what? You know, and I think that's just like a line that probably the Japanese government just insisted Christopher Nolan write into the script. You know, it's propaganda. It's pro-Japanese propaganda awkwardly shoved into the script, like, my wife and I went to Japan, and it's a great country, and they have a really nice vacation industry. In the fucking 30s? What? Like, what are you talking about? That's just a really awkward line. That's a way more awkward line than the sex, which is like actually relevant, where it's like, I've become death. That's probably the most awkward bit in the movie, where it's just like the forced pro-Japanese propaganda that's like, Japan's a great country, they're totally not ruled over by the grandson of a literal fascist or anything. Don't pay any attention to that. They're technically a democracy because they technically have a parliament, the same way that Britain is technically a democracy, in the same way that they could technically become a real democracy at any time, even though that would be called a coup, not an election, because that's how monarchies work. When you overthrow them, it's a coup, it's not an election. But enough about Japan. What else is there about this fantastic movie? Like I said, Robert Downey Jr. is caked under a lot of makeup as Louis Strauss, the horrible bastard who got Oppenheimer's security clearance revoked. Yet at the same time, I will say that the Einstein they got has way too thick a wig. You look at actual photos of Einstein, and his hair was a lot more stringy and kind of sparse. But this Einstein, his hair is like all blocky, and it's like a big chunk of hair, and that's not really how Einstein looked. So I have to subtract a couple points off for Einstein. But in terms of Louis Strauss and Oppenheimer, they both look just like A1 sauce, perfecto all the way through. They just look fucking great. One really hilarious phenomenon you'll notice if you go to see this in the theater, and I didn't see this in IMAX, I just saw it in a normal way because I think IMAX is a fucking gimmick. And I know Christopher Nolan is like, IMAX is the best, but I just like normal movies. I don't need IMAX. I remember seeing an IMAX thing on like The Ring of Fire, the Pacific Volcano chain, when I was like 8, and I was kind of like, okay, how the fuck is this different from a normal movie? It's just a normal movie, but like a bigger screen slightly. You barely even notice it. So I wouldn't recommend going to see this in IMAX. You don't need to. IMAX is a gimmick, just like 3D glasses or whatever. It's not going to substantially improve your viewing experience. One funny thing that I noticed while I was watching is during the bomb scene, for the couple seconds after the actual explosion, but before the big boom comes out, there was a point where everyone in the audience was like plugging their ears, and then they'd be like, oh, is it gonna happen? Maybe it just won't happen. And then they'd get scared again, like, oh shit, it's gonna happen. And it didn't happen. They'd be like, oh, okay, well, I guess it's not going to happen. And then they plug their ears again, and then they take their fingers off, and they'd be like, oh, I guess it's not going to happen. And then just like the loudest fucking sound ever. And it delivers. If you go to Oppenheimer for the big boom, you're gonna get the big fucking boom. It's gonna happen. It's gonna fucking happen. You're gonna see and hear that fucking thing, and it's fucking awesome. Holy shit. But yeah, a lot of people in the movie seem to forget that there's a delay between the explosion that you see and the sound, you know, like thunder and lightning. So it'll actually like it booms a bit after the mushroom cloud goes up, but it is there. So plug your fucking ears, because it goes hard, and it's fucking awesome when it happens. It's just like, wow, you know, this movie fucking delivers. One really admirable aspect of this movie is no CGI, none of that shit. Christopher Nolan's like, we're gonna have a real explosion, and we're gonna shoot on location in New Mexico. A lot of this was actually shot in New Mexico, and they refurbished Oppenheimer's original cabin, which I think is fucking cool. God damn, I like filmmaking that goes the extra mile like that and actually shoots where it says it's shot. Really increases the authenticity. And Christopher Nolan's like, we're not going to have any of that fucking CGI computer-generated gorbo on this. We're going to have a real fucking explosion. And it's just a great example, because, you know, you look at something like the end of Avengers Infinity shit, and there's like 500 gajillion explosions going off in every conceivable location, just like boom, 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 boom. But you don't care about any of them, because you know they're all fake. and it's like so obvious that they're all fake. And even if your brain doesn't consciously register that, you just have something in your mind that goes, yeah, I'm watching a fucking cartoon here. On the other hand, when you see one big explosion as opposed to a gajillion fake ones, even if it's just one relatively medium-sized explosion, you're going to go, holy fuck, this is awesome. This is what movies are all about, making shit blow the fuck up. And that is what movies are about. Time for some real fucking fire and shit, and we're not gonna just have a pansy-ass CGI crap-tastic explosion that just farts up and just, you know, this is the real shit. This shit goes hard. This shit doesn't fuck around. So I really like that. The explosion is definitely a moment worth looking forward to the whole movie. Just this countdown to when Oppenheimer's like, yep, we're gonna kill a bunch of people with this thing. It's gonna happen. Oh boy, it's my fantastic invention. There's some other really great bits of foreshadowing in this, like not only the sex bit, which I think is pretty well delivered, and I'm amazed that in 2023 we're still like juvenile enough to care about seeing a woman's breasts on screen. Like, not even like full frontal nudity, just some fucking breasts, just like grow the fuck up. I honestly can't believe that still causes controversy in today's day and age. But that's not the only bit of great foreshadowing we got in here. We also got the bit where he hears the shoes clattering on the auditorium floor, and we don't know what that is. We just see like these shoes all clattering in unison, and then it actually happens, and we're like, oh, he can like predict the future, and he's having all these horrible visions of how everyone is gonna fucking die. It's such a lovely bit. And I also really like this scene where everyone's cheering, but it's just like all completely quiet, and he can't hear anyone, and then the entire auditorium just blows the fuck up, and everyone's skin is peeling off. He goes out back, and like one guy's vomiting, which, you know, is probably real because everyone there is like fucking radio poisoned up the ass because, you know, they were literally just next to a fucking atomic bomb. But obviously they don't consider, you know, maybe we should put on a hazmat suit or two. Maybe we shouldn't be so, you know, close to this fucking death cloud. And that's just a great bit, that foreshadowing, the bit where he's like, oh shit, I can see everything. That part's really cool. I like the idea that Oppenheimer is kind of prescient, and this movie puts you in his head and gives you an insight into this guy who knows, like, oh shit, you know, my invention, my life's work is probably going to kill a shit ton of people, and there's nothing I can do to prevent that, and now my security clearance is getting revoked by Louis Strauss, the jealous bastard, and so nobody is going to listen to my warnings about the future of the atomic bomb and the H-bomb and all, and it's just going to be this whole kerfuffle. I also really like the use of black and white photography, how the furthest in the future is shot in black and white, but the scenes in the past are in color. That's a nice little subversion of, you know, how older scenes are typically in black and white, and that it kind of makes the past feel more alive than the present, and makes the late 1950s, in particular 1959, feel like, because I think some of the scenes set in 1954 are also in black and white, at least early on, and then they turn into color, but it makes the scenes in 1959 feel like they're in like this Cold War type state, like as if World War II is more lively and more colorful than the Cold War. Like the Cold War is this long, sludgy, dragging on, monochrome, dull period. But World War II is like this period of optimism and looking forward to the future and beating the Nazis and bringing our boys home and all that. And it's just kind of a really interesting filmmaking technique that Christopher Nolan does, the contrast between black and white and color. I really like that. I think Oppenheimer is a really great movie because you can tell that Christopher Nolan actually cares about telling Oppenheimer's story. He actually gives a shit. He's not just there for a paycheck. This is a story that means a lot to him symbolically. And I think that's something that more studios should pay attention to is just letting directors direct what they actually want to direct, instead of this system where it's like, hey, direct one for us and then you can direct one for you. It's like, no, if you have a director who's like a fountain of ideas, you want to properly utilize that and let them get their fucking ideas out there instead of forcing them to generate some algorithmically determined crap. I think if Christopher Nolan had just stuck to little character pieces like Memento or Insomnia instead of making fucking Batman movies, I'd probably have a lot more respect for him as a director. His Batman movies are so goddamn abysmal. They just like ruin his career and give me a sour taste of the guy. But after watching Oppenheimer, a story he obviously cares about, bringing to the big screen in dedicated passion and a blaze of glory, I'm kind of like, well, you know, he's respectable, he's okay. I don't hate the guy. He has some ideas worth giving a shit about. He has some technique. He has some panache. Like, I just don't think Christopher Nolan's realistic style lends itself at all to the fucking Batman universe. I have no idea what anyone was thinking when they were like, Christopher Nolan, it's time to make a Batman movie. They're like, fuck that shit. It's awful. It's really, really bad. And looking back at like 2012 with Bane, holy shit. There are a few movies from 2012 that are as dated as The Dark Knight Rises. The system where studios force directors to make movies they're not even really all that interested in is terrible for the movie industry. It fucks everyone over. It's like if Stanley Kubrick was forced to direct Animal House and he didn't want to, but the studio's just like, you gotta make National Lampoon's Animal House, and he's like, well shit. I guess I got to, or they won't let me make Barry Lyndon, so here goes. You know, it's like that. It's just like, don't force directors to make movies that they're clearly not interested in, or the result will be an unenthusiastic movie that everyone hates, cast and crew and viewers alike. Everyone is just miserable throughout it. It feels like a chore. I think Oppenheimer sort of breaks the Hollywood formula in a lot of admirable ways and kind of gives a big middle finger to Warner Brothers, of course. And I don't hate Warner Brothers in terms of most of their properties. I think a lot of their movies are way better than whatever is on Disney Plus or the like. But at the same time, they did make the Dark Knight Rises trilogy and forced Christopher Nolan to make that swill, so it's kind of like, well, you know, you kind of shot yourself in the foot here, just pumping out this crap. And now Universal seems to be using Nolan's skill a little more deftly, with a little more tact, and I can't really blame them for that. I do think Christopher Nolan really shines through here. Yeah, it's not like Quentin Tarantino, where it's like this really derivative, boring style that sucks, and he talks about his foot fetish all the time. He's like this annoying little cheddar goblin. I will say Christopher Nolan does have a very distinct, kind of admirable style. It's very modern. It's very up to the minute. He's very much the most modern director. He knows what's going on. He knows what people like. He knows how to pander to a big, wide audience with as much gravitas and bravado as possible. So in that way, I would compare something like Oppenheimer to those old epic movies, the Ten Commandments, Cleopatra back in the 50s, the big epic pictures with the big sets and design and costume and just spectacle that would just draw crowds from miles around. I think that's the most readily comparable thing to a Christopher Nolan movie. It's just a giant, big, surround sound feast for the eyes that you just can't ignore. Oddly enough, the criticism towards Oppenheimer has been pretty lackluster. There's not too much criticism, but there are some weird complaints that are leveled against it, like, we shouldn't be glorifying the army, and we shouldn't be glorifying the American war machine. And it's like, well, during World War II you should, because we were fighting Nazis, and there's nothing ethically objectionable about fighting Nazis. Like, during World War II, we were morally in the right. The only two things during World War II that I would argue were ethically objectionable were Japanese internment camps for innocent Japanese civilians and dropping the atomic bomb on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, two Japanese civilian cities that weren't involved in the war, and, well, they had munitions factories there, but point being, killing civilians or holding civilians captive against their will is a coward move, and I don't endorse that. Aside from that, if there's a movie set in World War II about besting the Nazis, I think that's an okay movie, and there's nothing wrong with celebrating our behavior in World War II, because we were literally saving the world from fascism. Now, that's not to say we shouldn't give just as much credit to the Soviets, of course. They killed way more Nazis than we were even capable of, but that's mostly a logistical issue. I think, for one, that fascists and Nazis suck ass, so there's nothing wrong with a movie set in World War II that glorifies the U.S. Army during the period of World War II. Not after that, but during World War II, I would argue, is one period in American history where, if I had been alive, I probably would have signed up for the army, or at least for work in a bomb factory or something, just to see Hitler fail at his megalomaniacal plans for world domination. I think that complaint kind of falls flat on its fucking face. There is a lot in this movie about how Oppenheimer is Jewish and how Hitler rejects the so-called Jewish science, that being quantum theory, because Hitler is, stupid and bad and generally just an incompetent leader all around who wasn't interested in actually winning the war so long as he could stroke his ego. So Oppenheimer sort of takes the advantage over that and takes advantage of the quantum theory because Hitler has no idea what he's doing on that front and isn't very smart and just generally doesn't know how to use the scientific apparatus of Germany. So that's a nice touch, I think, is pointing out that Oppenheimer, the entire movie, believes that this super weapon is going to be used against the Nazis who are killing his own people, and then it turns out it's just used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and Oppenheimer doesn't really have any personal investment in that or anything. And it's just kind of a massive waste. I would argue this movie does a pretty good job of pointing out that killing a bunch of random civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is an ethically objectionable behavior, no matter which way you slice it. And at least in my personal opinion, we shouldn't have killed all those hundreds of thousands of civilians. We could have easily expended the American war machine to go in, assassinate Hirohito, and we could have killed any fascist fanatics who were still loyal to the empire and kept the civilians alive. If you take a figure like Hiro Onoda, the Japanese holdout who stayed fanatic to the empire even after the war had ended and killed anyone on his secluded little desert island, that guy's fucking crazy. That guy's a way more objectionable person than Oppenheimer. That guy's like a scumbag. So I'm not sure exactly why it is that we here, at least in America, tend to hold Japan to an entirely different ethical standard than the rest of the world, and we sort of excuse their fascist fanaticism. There's nothing cool or neat or quirky about being a fanatic towards a fascist regime. There's nothing cool about that. It's no different from what happened over in Nazi Germany. And if we had just killed all the Japanese soldiers who were the fighting force and kept the civilians alive, and then instituted a democratic system over in Japan, Japan would be a better country today. I would probably watch more anime, and I'd have more respect for Japan. But as it stands, Japan is one of the only countries left, to the best of my knowledge, where the leader is literally the grandson of a fascist. So I really have no respect for the Japanese way of doing things, or the way that they tend to glamorize and fetishize people like Hiro Onoda, who I think are just some of the lowest of the low. I think it's high time we stop celebrating war criminals in any capacity. And of course I hold Vietnam War veterans to the same standard. I consider them to be fanatics on the same level as the Japanese army during World War II, or the kamikaze or the like. I really have no respect for war criminals or fascists or extreme nationalists or any of that bullshit. I think it's lousy, and we ought to re-examine the ways that we hold certain countries and certain groups of people to double standards, and the ways that we sort of indirectly promote fascist ideologies. But I do think Oppenheimer is very effective in kind of bringing that dialogue to the forefront, making you think, hey, this is kind of fucked up. There's a lot of moral gray area here. If there's one term that could be used to describe the entirety of Oppenheimer, it would be moral gray area. Strauss and Oppenheimer and all these figures all working towards some kind of diabolical goal that they really don't understand the ramifications of entirely until it's too late and it's out of their hands and the world has changed irrevocably. I think that's a very interesting premise, and the script is pretty dang good at communicating that. The constant emotional turmoil that all these characters are going through gradually in the soup. I would argue the most effective moment is the scene where you see the entire crowd getting their flesh burned off and the guy vomiting, and Oppenheimer, his mood just slowly shifting from celebration to complete dismay. Just his mind falls apart and you can just see every piece just, it just kind of drains out of him and he's just like, holy shit, I'm such a bastard. And I hear, oh, let's not celebrate Oppenheimer. And sure, I'm not saying Oppenheimer was a good guy or anything. Like I said, I do think this movie tends to focus a little too much on how Strauss is the bad guy and Oppenheimer's the good guy. And I think that's a little simplistic. I don't think the movie ever really goes too heavy into that. You still get the idea that Strauss could have some positive points and Oppenheimer definitely has some negative points. He's certainly naive at the very least. I do think it's a stupid criticism to be like, how dare you glorify this bomb creator? And it's like, well, the movie isn't really glorifying him. It's just a biopic that kind of examines his life and where he's coming from and kind of tries to put you in his shoes a little bit, make you see things from his angle. But it's not like a pro-Oppenheimer piece or anything. That'd be kind of fucked up. I mean, nobody's making like an Oppenheimer is the greatest guy piece. You might like him a little more after this. You might kind of respect the scientific process, or you might not. I think scientists are kind of boring people, but this movie kind of makes him seem interesting and kind of mysterious and sort of a fun character. That's mainly probably just due to Cillian Murphy's performance. In real life, he was probably a little more dry and a little more reserved. But overall, I think if you think this movie is trying to like promote Oppenheimer or like glorify what he does, you're kind of fucking stupid, because this is just a movie with a gray character, like a very morally gray character who at the end you're kind of thinking, well, is he in the right? Is he in the wrong? Maybe he's neither. People who make the complaint that Oppenheimer is like glorifying the guy have clearly never seen a movie with like an anti-hero or a conflict or anything like that. Overall, Oppenheimer isn't about whether Oppenheimer is good or bad. It's about just an interesting guy in history. Whether he's good or bad really has no bearing on whether he's interesting. Like, I'd watch a frickin' movie about, like, Hernan Cortez or some bastard like that, provided it was presented in an interesting way. That's kind of the point of cinema, to just make things interesting. Not to say, well, Hernan Cortez is good, but if there was a movie with Hernan Cortez that was, like, cool to watch, I'd watch it. Even if, like, the main character was a bastard, I'd sit through that. I do think Oppenheimer is interesting in that it says a lot about how history will remember you and how people will interpret Oppenheimer after his death, and the whole time that he's living even, he's thinking constantly about like how history is going to see him, how people in the future are going to interpret things. He's got that foresight that enables him to think, well, how am I going to be written about in the history books? Am I going to be a hero, villain, something in between? And he has to constantly consider this, all while he's working on the Manhattan Project and developing the bomb. So yeah, I think this is a very interesting movie. Cillian Murphy and Robert Downey Jr. in particular really knock it out of the park. The costumes, the sets are all great. The practical explosion effects are really, really top-notch. As an effects aficionado in particular, I respect Christopher Nolan's ability to bring that atomic death to the big screen in a really impressive and fun way. And remember, of course, if you go to see this in the movie theater, plug your fucking ears, because it gets epic. And I will say that you'll have fun with this movie. You might cry at some points, you might cheer at some points. It's only if you're not autistic. You'll have more suggestion towards Christopher Nolan's sweeping soundtrack and the way he kind of tries to toy with your emotions and get you feeling all dramatic. That doesn't really work on me, but I do respect Oppenheimer as a production. As a film, it's a very nice little production. And I wasn't particularly like crying or cheering at any specific point. I wasn't really able to lend myself to that vein of manipulation or suspend my disbelief to that extent. But, you know, if you're not autistic, you probably will feel a whole fucked up, wild range of emotions during this entire thing. I can only imagine it's that sort of movie that just makes you a torrent 1 second and a gust of energy the next. Just in terms of historical accuracy, I wouldn't say Oppenheimer is the most historically accurate movie. The look is spot on, but I'm sure plenty of events and lines are invented just for dramatic effect, which is fine because it's a movie and it doesn't need to be entirely 100% accurate. It's a dramatized recreation of Oppenheimer's life, so they can invent lines and little scenes and little bits that didn't happen, that just happen to look cool, that are just nice to see and go, wow, you know, this looks awesome, this looks really interesting. And of course, this is the movie that made me stop watching Big Joel videos. I'm never gonna take anything Big Joel says seriously ever again, like, how come Oppenheimer has sex? That's just the most puerile, stupid, reductive film criticism I've ever seen. And he shat on fucking Bohemian Rhapsody, too, with Rami Malek, who's also an Oppenheimer. He shits on Bohemian Rhapsody. Like, it's a good fucking movie, you know? Is it the most accurate rendition of Queen's career? Is it the most accurate retelling of that? No. But it's an okay movie, you know? It's a fucking alright movie. Why get labeled as this bitter contrarian while jackasses like Big Joel get to prance their completely unqualified bullshit opinions around? It really just boggles the mind, because, like, I've given plenty of positive reviews to movies that other people have just, like, shit on. Like, I was positive about Terminator Dark Fate. I thought Terminator Dark Fate was fucking good. Everyone else shit on it. I like Holmes and Watson. Everyone else shit on it. I like a lot of fucking movies that people don't like. And I like a lot of movies that people do like. I like a shit ton of movies. It just happens I don't like certain movies, so people get pissy over that. Like, yeah, Bohemian Rhapsody, I like Bohemian Rhapsody. Oppenheimer, I fucking like Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer is okay. Oppenheimer is a good movie. It's an okay movie. Am I gonna say that Oppenheimer is bad just because Oppenheimer has sex in it? No, because that's fucking stupid. Imagine being that fucking juvenile that you're, like, giggling about a fucking sex scene in 2023. Man, maybe we haven't come that far since the days of Oppenheimer, I tell you what. Anyway, what do I have to say about Oppenheimer? Is it Poppinheimer or is it Droppenheimer? Well, here's my final score. I give Oppenheimer an 8 out of 10. That's right, I'm giving Oppenheimer an 8 out of 10. I would give my favorite Christopher Nolan movie, Memento, probably like a 9 out of 10. But I'd say Oppenheimer is now my second favorite Christopher Nolan movie. Out of all of his movies, I have to give it to Oppenheimer just because the characterization's good, the script is good, the set pieces are great, the acting is really good. I think Cillian Murphy's going to get huge off of this role. He's going to be the next big thing. I haven't heard of him because he was only in one of the 28 Days Later movies and a couple of others, but I do think he's absolutely the right guy for this role. He looks a shit ton like Oppenheimer, and it really is the performance of a lifetime. Will I be surprised if Oppenheimer wins an Oscar? No, not really. It's a dang good movie. It's the type of movie that tends to win Oscars, and I think it's pretty dang good. So in terms of revitalizing Christopher Nolan's career, making people interested in both his career and Oppenheimer as a historical figure, in terms of being educative, in terms of communicating history in a fun way, in terms of communicating science, I think this is a very informative piece. It's a very well done piece, and I'll give it an 8 out of 10. I really liked it. It was fun to watch. And yeah, that's about all I have to say about Oppenheimer. It's worth seeing, so you should go see it before it's out of theaters. Go see it now, and plug your ears once it gets to the boomy part, because it's gonna rupture your eardrums if you don't. So yeah, just keep this in mind. Anyway, yeah, that's all I really have to say about Oppenheimer. Until next time, sayonara.